Hello, I'm Dr. Tess Laurie, and welcome to Tess Talks. Today I'm speaking with Professor Angus Dalgleish, who's a professor of oncology at St. George's, University of London, and has been speaking about what he has been seeing and has written a letter recently to the British Medical Journal expressing concerns about the COVID-19 vaccines. So I'm very happy to speak to Professor Dalgleish today. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
Could you have so many letters after your name. Could you please explain what they mean?
Okay. Well, the first one I use is the MD, which is the Doctor of Medicine, which is my thesis. And so I no longer use the MBBS, the ordinary doctor's one. And I was proud of the MD because I did it quite late in my career. And I did it on HIV and retroviruses, and particularly how HIV enters cells. And I co-discover of the receptors, a very well recognized paper. Then my other letters, I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in the UK and in Australia. And the reason for Australia is that after doing all my basic work here, I became a flying doctor in Australia, where I got to know real medicine at the coalface, as it were. And then I decided to train in internal medicine and went to Brisbane. And then I decided to focus on oncology. So I went to Sydney, where oncology, even in those days, had an interesting immunological bent. Diseases such as myeloma were treated by the immunologist, not the oncologist. And that had a major imprinting on my subsequent experience. The last one's a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, which is an elected forum for various achievements. And the other one was elected was fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists, and that's in view of all the basic work I did on HIV with regards to my thesis.
Wow. Well, what a resume and what a lot of hard work. I have to say the most exciting bit seems to be, to me, being the flying doctor. I always had that at the back of my mind too, especially when I was newly qualified, thinking that would be a fun job to have. Do you actually have a pilot's license as well, or?
Oh yes, I had the pilot's license. It was the carrot that got me to apply for the job. They said that they were expanding it, so it was no longer just going to be a Royal Flying Ambulance Service, as what the Flying Doctor Service was really. But they wanted doctors to pilot their own planes and go out to remote communities on a regular basis. Therefore, it wasn't practical to have pilots and doctors. And I leaped at that chance because I've always wanted to be a pilot. But I was short-sighted, so I was never able to get a RAF scholarship or anything like that. So it was a great way. I flew for some years afterwards and really enjoyed it, but gave it up because you need to do it very regularly. I could make the legal minimum, but I concluded it wasn't enough to be safe, so I dropped it.
So, well, let's talk about your recent letter to the British Medical Journal. What inspired that, and what was that about?
Well, what inspired that was the letter that they published by Wang et al., which basically tried to silence anybody who criticized any of the mainstream handling of COVID as being deniers, irresponsible, criminal, whatever. I mean, it was an appalling letter. And Elizabeth Hart and others were involved in trying to decry this. So I wrote this in support of that. And by the way, this is what I'm seeing. And it is, by the way, this is what I'm seeing. And it is important, I think, to be aware of red flags, etc., and to not ignore them. I was told several authorities that I had concerns about the COVID vaccines because even my son and his friends had bad reactions to them. And I was told by people very high up in the vaccine task force that these were just mere coincidence anecdotes of no consequences. It was perfectly safe and effective. And then I hear more and more and more things. And I realize that this is not a way of dealing with things, just pushing aside everything as they're safe and effective, be quiet. So now with the cancer, what is important is that what I'm seeing, these people are not going to be showing up in the death figures anytime soon. What I'm seeing is they may in the next few months, but what I'm seeing is a trend which I have asked others, are you seeing this too? And they are reporting, yes. I mean, I had an incredible response from a colleague in Australia. He said, not only am I seeing this in my patients, but my own sister developed bone metastasis after a booster for a tumor that, she hadn't suspected. She was well, etc. And I said, this is exactly what I've seen in one of my close friends too. But it's been a few months now that I've been looking at patients. I do a lot of melanoma, and I was one of the first to treat patients with immunotherapy. It's now the standard. We use these antibodies, but 20 to 30 years ago, I was using a very basic vaccines. We tried dozens of different types, but actually one of the most basic heat-kill ones is still by far the best. And I was boosting it with things like interleukin-2, all these old cytokines. And we had some great responses. And I suddenly realized over a 2-month period that patients who'd been stable, one of them, the shortest was 5 years, going up to 20, and very recently one for 18 years, unbelievably long. They were all stage 4, which was meant to have a survival of about 18 months. So, these are quite incredible responses. They all started relapsing after they had the booster. So was this coincidence? No, I don't think it was. I know I've now seen 7. It was first 6. I've seen another one in the last week or so. And is there a possible reason for this? Yes, there is, because the booster causes a suppression of the innate immune response. This is being reported rather bizarrely. And it's thought to be one of the reasons why people who have boosters are more likely to contract COVID. So the first thing is, why would you give a booster that's more likely to get you the infection you're trying to vaccinate against? So I question the whole thing is madness. I think that any vaccine that needs a booster isn't a vaccine, in my opinion, unless it's therapeutic like we use in cancer. And then I thought even more logical about it, because I've written several things about the COVID. It's not like I'm naive to it. And I came very well primed because of all my core work on HIV, where I discovered the receptor. And I think we also got the pathogenesis right. I think that HIV induces AIDS, not because it kills CD4 cells, and it was the CD4 receptor I identified. That's how the cell gets in and kills the T cell. No, standing back and looking at it, I was the first to say, this is not the explanation. I know it's very simple and it makes sense, but it's not the explanation, because other people get infected and they don't get ill, and the chimpanzees all get infected and they don't get ill. So what is it that gives you the AIDS? And it actually is a pan-immune reaction to a bit of the virus that looks like human transplant antigen, HLA. And we pointed this out and demonstrated that I think it's the most likely suspect, but very little has been taken up by that. But I believe that was a big insight. And I actually often in the days with people with severe AIDS, I was treating them with steroids. And they were doing incredibly well because you were dampening down the fire. And it was the activation and fire that was causing the immune suppression, not the other way round. So coming at COVID with this, after hearing these terrible reports from Italian hospitals and things, I realized that the same sort of thing was going on some way or other. These patients were dying of overactivation of the immune response. They weren't dying of hypo. But of course, if you overactivate the immune response and throw your resources at something very ineffectually, you're going to exhaust it. I realized that's what was going on with COVID, so I was interested in that. But my entree into what was going on with COVID was the fact that with Børge Sørensen in Norway, I had worked with him, and we had developed a very good HIV vaccine, which I was very annoyed was a kind of, everybody always wanted to put it down, but it's called Vax4X, but it was published in the Lancet, and indeed Professor Pollard from the COVID thing was the lead author on it, where it was shown that in people who were HIV infected a long time, if they received this vaccine, their viral load collapsed. The problem was that people said, oh, but the CD4 count should come up. And that, in an ideal world, that was true. And I worked with Birger Sørensen and pointed out that if you used a stronger cell-mediated adjuvant, then it probably would come up. So we did a small randomized study, and lo and behold, it did come up. So that vaccine was all ready to go big time. Celgene, a big American company, which I'd worked with thalidomide analogs for a long time, they thought it was a good idea and they were going to put this through. But then Bristol Myers Squibb bought them up and said, we're not interested in HIV, and killed it. So the point of this is we had done all this work. We had understood about the need for the adjuvants and what was important, that Birger and I came it from two different sources, but we had one thing in common. We both realized if you use the entire envelope of HIV as the vaccine, it would fail. Too many epitopes, and the reason you have too many epitopes is because you're hiding one or two that are vital. They're acting as a big shield. Now, all the envelope vaccines over the last 30 years have totally failed. And here's Birger's one, actually, it was the stepping stone to complete success. Why? Because he just picked 4 epitopes that if they were to mutate or destroy the virus would collapse. And that's where I thought, this is brilliant, and this is what I've evolved. I've found one other epitope which we've added, and we now think it's the complete vaccine. So the reason we're going through this is that when COVID sequence became available, Birger was on the phone. Shall we apply the same approach to the COVID and make a vaccine for this, or the same principles? I said, yes, I completely agree. And you go for the core components, and the bit that we found with HIV, you need the core, the gag, not the whole outside. In this case, the outside envelope is called the spike. And when that was published, the whole world and its dogs all jumped on, we'll take the spike and we'll drop it in our favorite engine, whether it be adeno for AstraZeneca or messenger RNA for the others. They didn't think anymore just dropping this spike in. Birger said we need to pick out the bits that are the contained and shared and will be the Achilles heel. And while he was doing this, we did something called blast analysis. A blast analysis looks at that spike protein and said, does it have any homology with anything else? Well, there's a very simple technique, came back and said, 80% of this has human homologies. And homologies to platelet factor 4 and myelin were mentioned by Birger's team. So, you would expect if you don't exclude these things, you're going to end up with problems with clotting and neurological things. Now, we mentioned all this and told everybody, but no one took any notice. I was discarded as a simple clinician. What did I know about this sort of thing? But I was working with one of the best biophysicists, vaccine designers in the world. So I was very sort of annoyed and upset about that. But while we were doing this, it was obvious too that this COVID virus had a furin cleavage site in it, which others had spotted. The sequence of the Nature paper, and the Chinese colleagues spoke about everything in this sequence except the furin cleavage site, which is most remarkable because they put it there in the first place. And, in previous experiments. But more importantly, there were 6 other sites, inserts, which greatly increased the physical charge of the virus. And as such, this physical charge would allow it not only to latch on to the ACE receptor, the main ACE receptor, but also to bypass it and use co-receptors. And so it made it very, very, I would describe it made the virus attached to a cell the way a fridge magnet does to a fridge door. I mean, once it's inside of it, bang, it's none of this special key viruses going into receptors are meant to be, like they've got the key and they turn it out and then walk in. Now, this thing would be like blast, it would go straight in. And these features are never seen in viruses. They say that coronaviruses, they say the furin cleavage site is in some other phase and affect other animals miles and miles away. They've never ever been seen. But there are reports in the literature saying that they've been added in laboratory experiments to make coronaviruses more effective to human cells, and this is the gain of function, etc. So that is what we saw, and we were very keen and designed a virus based on this, but nobody took any interest because...
You just remind us of the date. So that was that sort of early 2020?
This was very early 2020. The paper came out in about February, and we'd got all this by March because we had entree and was hoping that we'd be able to get a vaccine based on it. We sent it to the cabinet at the level where it was looked at by the obvious culprits who saw that, and we now know from dispatches that they had concerns about this. It's all been all over the news, but decided to not only ignore it, but to cancel it. So we were unable to publish it.
So which, when you refer to who it was sent to, do you mean SAGE or the Parliamentary Risk Assessment?
Well, they would have sent it to Valence and Whitty and SAGE and Farrar, and we know that Farrar and Valence talked to Fauci about these, and they came to, I call it a conspiracy, to pretend it didn't happen, it wasn't there. Why would you do that? I mean, that's the big unanswered question. But we sent our paper then to all the top journals, and they all rejected it as not in the public interest. So it was clearly, it never had that before. They usually pretend to find problems with it scientifically and keep it for 2 or 3 weeks. They don't normally
2 or 3 months.
Yeah, 2 or 3 months, exactly. So that was the first thing that I was very concerned about. Then the next thing was this workup to a lockdown. And, I was very, very anti-lockdown. And I just used the very simple observation. You lock down, everything else collapses. The problem is it doesn't collapse straight away. It takes months. And in the case of heart attack, strokes, it'll be a few weeks. But in the case of cancers, it'll be several months, and it will be disastrous. And besides, this is a respiratory virus. It is not Ebola. And I had the strong feeling, and I wrote in the Mail, I thought Chris Whitty seems to treat this virus as if it's like Ebola. No, it's not. It has been mutated, but very aggressive viruses attenuate. Wave after wave, they attenuate. And that's exactly what was happening with COVID. And I and many others said this is exactly what will happen. Lockdown will be an absolute disaster. And all the other things, follow the science. Follow the science. There was no science to this. I mean, Fauci and co admitted they invented the 2 meters. They invented wear masks. Fauci, under interrogation, was unable to point one paper that supported using masks for this virus. And I also was very cynical because the smallest hole in a mask is 3 times bigger than the virus. So a whole host of things. So when it came to the vaccine, I felt, well, we've lost. We lost. Nobody would support our vaccine and listen to our arguments. But Big Pharma came in, bang, 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 and they got all the support and had AstraZeneca and all these. And so it did appear from the initial figures that, the vaccine was going to be useful, and it was going to be given to people over 70 and at risk.
May I just ask, as someone who's helped develop a vaccine before, what was your opinion of the speed at which these new technologies were released and were developed? And were you curious as to the pharmacokinetics, the biodistribution, how these new types of vaccines moved around the body, and where those data were, or were you sort of just going with the flow and seeing what what the
I I was very, very familiar with both AZ technology, as I'd been involved with the Jenner Institute many years before. And I was also very aware of messenger RNA, as I had sat on the scientific board for 5 years of a major company that calls itself the messenger RNA vaccine company. Well, I knew then there were great problems in taking this forward into the clinic. And, I left that position 5 years ago. It was taken over in a big deal with an American company. So I knew that there were problems with all these things. And in both cases, all they did was drop this spike into their existing technology. Now, they assured us that the vaccines would just stay where they were put, in a depot, as it were. And that would be it. And we were told that evidence there. We now know that nothing could be further from the truth, particularly with the messenger RNA. And they've been identified from people who had the vaccines in every organ going. So that was an incredible piece of misleading. But the real thing for me was, first of all, I started becoming aware of people I knew getting myocarditis, small strokes, etc. But the real thing was the VAERS data, which Pfizer tried to hide for 75 years, but it was brought out in a court action. Because hidden in plain sight, this is the main thing about it, hidden in plain sight was that the side effects from this vaccine, Pfizer, was completely, utterly unacceptable in any vaccine program going. And I must say, any regulator that passed the vaccine on that data clearly is not fit for the job, because my colleagues could see all this data and point out that the risks, the risks of dying if you had a serious adverse event from the vaccine was far higher than if you got the virus itself. So where all this data starts accumulating, one, that the regulatory authorities have either been lied to, or they haven't taken notice of the very, very data that's meant to be used in support. I got to be very suspicious. So that brings me, I have a natural suspicion to this as time has gone on. And so for my observations with the cancer patients one case I didn't take any notice of. Two, I thought that's the second. But when you get the third, fourth, fifth, you realize this is extremely unlikely to be related to chance, to pure chance and pure progression. And so, as I said, I asked other people, and it's been reported. I spoke on the phone to a doctor at a clinic in Germany. He's seeing it. I emailed a colleague of mine in Australia. He comes back, he's seeing it. And we know Ryan Cole has been broadcasting his findings about that for some time now. So there is a pattern, but what I want done is for it to be really actively monitored, because at the moment it's not being actively monitored and people are told it's coincidence, don't cause trouble. We're trying to prevent something causing trouble here.
Exactly. In fact, our MHRA, the regulatory agency that's in the UK, they actually haven't done an assessment of a safety audit in 2 years, more than 2 years since COVID's been launched. So it's incredible that they've allowed and emerged or conditionally authorized, given temporary authorization to all these new drugs, and not only the vaccines, and they haven't bothered to do a safety audit. You would think they would be doing safety audits every 3 months or every 6 months, and there's so much alarming data on their database, and yet they're just saying safe and effective, as you say. So.
Well, what's even worse is I know that events which have clearly been caused by the virus have not been recorded, and that the patients have tried to point this out. We hear an awful lot coming out of the press now, but the doctors haven't recorded it. One of the reasons is it's quite a bit of extra work to do a yellow card on something like this, but especially when there's great pressure not to rock the boat, as it were. And so I think the MHRA even confessed that a yellow card system only picked up about 10% of events. I would suggest that probably only 1% from what I've known, because I've asked lots of people who have had bad side effects, and none of them, that to their knowledge, reported it. When they tried to get it, make sure it was reported, their doctor wouldn't report it because he said it's nothing to do with me, it's up to the person who gave you the vaccine, which was done in a field somewhere in a tent to report it. They're no longer there.
And many young people who are not feeling well, they've all been told, oh, well, it's, you might have fever and whatever. So in actual fact, amongst, the young people that I know, they have friends who, they take 2 days off. They've taken 2 days off after their vaccine and, knowing that they're not going to make it back to work afterwards. So it's kind of been just this information has been disseminated that it's okay and normal to have a reaction like that, but it's absolutely not for a medicine of any sort to make a healthy person sick. It can't be good medicine. It's just logical. It's common sense, really.
Well, the other thing I really want to get across is I'm totally against all boosters. The boosters, I believe, is a moronic thing. I don't know how on earth they ever justify these. The reason for this is that the vaccine, the first vaccines were aimed against alpha delta virus. So you're giving a booster to this because your immunity is waned for it, allegedly. However, this virus has long since departed the planet, possibly, let alone all the other ones. So you're boosting against something that's not there. Now, this is the first reason why people go down with COVID after their boosters, because you harness this enormous immune response into fighting something that's not there, therefore weakening the defenses of the innate immune system for new viruses. This is why, even there was an Oxford group published the Lancet report that you're 44% more likely to get one of these new Omicron viruses if you've been vaccinated versus those who've not been vaccinated. And the second big thing I wanted to point out, in addition to, we published all our thoughts on how you should use the sequencing for a good vaccine in a magazine journal called the Quarterly Review of Biophysics Discovery, disguised as a vaccine paper, where it's actually been downloaded over 250,000 times. So this is something that nobody was meant to be interested in and ignore, etc. Well, we also published a different group of us that the reason for being cynical about coronavirus vaccines is everyone previously had failed and caused toxicity in monkeys and things like that. So we were basically asking why this was. Now, one of the reasons for this is that these coronavirus and similar viruses, when you look at all of these papers, two or three things come out. One is antigenic sin, and the other is antibody-dependent enhancement. And it would look like both of these are relevant to the COVID vaccine. So they're going, and I don't know why the governments are doing this. Moderna is going to put Omicron 1, 2 into a booster thing, so it's all there. You've got the package. If the antigenic sin thing is correct, and I've got reasons to believe that it is, that all you'll do is boost the response to the first vaccine, which is against something which is no longer there. It will not cover and broaden for the others. The other thing is, by creating so many antibodies, you create a soup that actually enables antibody-dependent enhancement. So you have antibodies will make any new virus even more likely to infect the thing. And that's what I believe we're seeing, because the number of people I know who've gone down with COVID again just after the vaccine, it's unbelievable. And if this is reported, the response is even more unbelievable, and that is, it's a pity you didn't have it sooner.
It's very difficult for people. You have to really put oneself in their shoes. And they're being told by the governments and the doctors they trust that they need these injections, and the injections are going to prevent COVID and prevent, and help them get on with their lives. And so when they get sick, it's almost impossible for them to consider that it could be from these injections that they're constantly told are so safe. A colleague of mine went to a funeral the other day of a relation and who had died, in his opinion, as a result of the COVID vaccine. It was a stroke. And he said there were 4 other people among the funeral party that had been seriously injured with post-vaccination with a clotting disorder of some sort. And none of them had put 2 and 2 together, and all of them expressed the sense that at least they didn't get COVID. So there was the sense that it protected them from COVID, and they had at least not got COVID, and they didn't put the 2 and 2 together that in actual fact the injection may have caused their clotting disease. So, and as I say, just in terms of the sheer proportion of people who were there, it's just, it was crazy and quite distressing for my colleague. So it's very difficult for the public to get their heads around what is going on, and it's hard for them to hear us. So, do you have anything you could say or what do you say to people who struggle to see that their injury may be associated with the vaccine?
Well, I mean, I tell all my patients that they must not have the booster vaccines because of my experience and insight, and I think that the younger colleagues are all told to shut up, and in Australia they could be reported and taken off the register for spreading misinformation. I mean, this is the Orwellian scenario that we are in.
In your life, you've been practicing for a very long time. Have you ever had this sort of directive come from above that you're not allowed to speak to your patients about X, Y, and Z?
No, never, ever. In fact, it's been the other way around. That certainly in the cancer doctor, you have to tell them a bit too much in order to help them make decisions. So. No, never anything like this. It's just been awful. But I feel that it's very contradictory, because you're meant to do the best for your patient, but you have the GMC and other regulatory authorities threatening you with misinformation if you suspect that the vaccine might be doing more harm than good, even though the evidence is now on the website. Everything is done by stealth. Certain things on the website, they don't make an announcement about things. It just suddenly appears, or the wording changes. Some of these things, like with the myocarditis, etc., it should have been an immediate stop. But in the first case of anybody under 40, 45, it should have been banned immediately, and they should be looked into it. You have eminent cardiologists, and who who they are. Malhotra, I can't pronounce the name, but he went from a pro-vaccine propaganda program to don't touch it with a barge pole. It's poison. Stop it. You must stop it now. And I agree with him coming from a similar big clinical exposure to see these things. Our duty.
Many other UK cardiologists who are expressing concerns as well.
Many. And our sort of mantra should be first do no harm. So you cannot remain silent when you suspect. And I'll be the first to say, we might be wrong, we might be overlooking, we might be linking things speciously that's not cause and effect. But I don't think so. And one of the things about being an older doctor is you have an awful lot of experience. And a lot of medicine is an art form. It's not science. And if you follow the science that Valence, Whitty and Fauci calls science, then you end up with disaster, because they're not following any science at all. I don't believe that anything they've said follow the science. I think it's been an absolute disaster, and they should be ashamed of themselves for going along with this all the way through. So I think you have to say something. The pattern is odd. It's not fitting, and I'm worried. It's beholden on us to say, even if it turns out not to be true, we now know enough that the boosters are doing nobody any good. So no one's going to lose by it, but we keep piling them in. it seems to be that people are going down after the boosters. I mean, obviously, a lot of people had problems with the first vaccine, the second vaccine, and also the generalization, the younger you were, the worse it was. But what we're seeing now is people are okay until they have the booster. That's what I'm seeing with my own eyes. It's the boosters that people are then getting a relapse of their melanoma or a B cell. The B cell was certainly predicted by some that if you keep stimulating B cells non-specifically, you're more likely to get lymphomas and things. And we now know that a lot of people have low-grade B cell malignancy, chronic leukemia, very low-grade lymphoma. So perhaps it's just revealing these diagnoses in the people there. But again, we've got a logic to it. If it's suppressing the innate immune response, that is the immune response we know contains melanoma and B-cell malignancies. So it all fits. Therefore, I believe we have a duty to bring this to everybody's attention. And the regulators have a duty to see, is this really true? Because it's not going to show up in death figures for several months, by which time it could be a catastrophe.
Yeah. Have you seen any young people with cancers in your practice?
I don't see many young people. I'm not allowed to see people under the ages of 18 for the way they've hived it off. It then goes into pediatric and adolescent. But what has been drawn to my attention are the offspring of colleagues with various things. And I've been surprised and horrified to find young people, I'm saying 20, who've been forced to have a booster vaccine for enrollment into colleges. This nonsense still going on. And not that long ago, travel, who were had COVID in the first wave for 2 or 3 days and then fine. And they had the vaccine and they've gone down with dreadful cardiological problems and long COVID. I mean, really bad. I've actually called to make sure my own eyes, one of these poor people. And I was amazed to find that they were super, super fit. And once they had that booster vaccine, they could hardly get out of bed. I mean, they were describing absolute classic long COVID from the vaccine. So once again, one swallow doesn't make a summer, but we're on these various internet things with other physicians. And one of the guys, after I'd seen this, he comes on a couple of weeks later, and he said, has anybody seen long COVID after vaccination? I've now had my 6th 30-year-old and younger patient go down with long COVID after the vaccine. They'd all had the virus naturally and recovered. So why would you give a vaccine to somebody? And that was my first big argument. And I got into arguments, they call them debates, on a television thing with somebody who told me he was a very experienced person involved in developing vaccines and bugs and things like that, and antibiotics, what have you. I said, why on earth would you want to give a booster to somebody without checking whether they had a good immune response, either naturally or to their compulsory vaccine in the first place? And they said, it's far too much effort to go in doing tests for that sort of thing. To which I replied, well, I'd just been away for the first time for quite some time, and I had more COVID tests than I had hot dinners on that trip. So I said it's clearly not a problem if you're doing a test and trace kind of business. But it would have been very simple to run that and much cheaper than what they're charging now for the booster vaccine. So there's so much that's illogical that's been going on this. And there's so much, this is my opinion, it is science, follow it. I mean, Fauci actually said on the thing, he said, if you criticize me, you criticize science, and you can't do that. I mean, that's his logic. He is science, and you can't criticize it, whatever he says. Anyhow, it's a distraction.
Yeah. So you've said very clearly that people shouldn't take boosters.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion on what people can do if they if they are concerned about the effects of the vaccine. I'm thinking, in terms of repurposed medicines that have been suggested and are being used widely, but we don't have a lot of evidence on them for vaccine injury. Do you have an opinion on anything like that?
Well, certainly, I've had a lot of friends who had problems with both COVID in the very early days and then the vaccines now. And I've noted that some of them say they're a bit short of breath after having had a booster. They just don't feel well. And I've suggested soluble aspirin for that because the spike causes microclots when it attaches to the ACE protein. And I've been impressed that several people have said that it really improves that particular symptom, but not the fatigue and tiredness. It just seems to improve that they feel better. They don't feel short of breath, but it doesn't affect the muscle aches and the general overall tiredness. And anyhow, I've been working for years again, it comes from my melanoma patient. I said to this melanoma patient of mine who'd only gone halfway through a vaccine program before it had been pulled, but she remained remarkably well. And I said, on follow-up, I said, "You're unbelievably well. You should have progressed. You must be taking something I don't know about." She said, "No." Anyway, she finally said, "Well, I don't know whether it makes any difference, but I've been over to America to a clinic and I got hold of some stuff called low-dose naltrexone." So I said, "Tell me about it." And so I looked into it, I researched it. And I was in America, I went to see Bahari, who was the doctor who salvaged it and was starting to give it up. And I became aware that this was real because, I was trained as a classical pharmacologist. The more you give, the better it is. The idea of a low dose had a benefit. But I could embrace that because of cytokines. Cytokines efficacy is all in a bell-shaped curve. So you get to a point, if you give more, you actually lose the effect. And I realized it was going on here. So I cut a long story short, done a lot of basic research. I've found that the inflammatory things improve incredibly with low-dose naltrexone. I wanted to know why that was. The Bihari and Zoltan fellow who done all the lab work said it was because it modulated opiate receptors. And I couldn't see how that explained dramatic improvements in Crohn's, psoriasis, and some of my patients who weren't very stable. So we published this. I went looking, having done the CD4 receptor for HIV, I applied the same technique and did receptor screens for naltrexone. And up came TLR9. And TLR9 is a major inflammatory pathway. If you stimulate it, it shuts down IL-6. Interleukin-6, its generic name is cancer growth factor. So at a stroke, it told me why my cancer patients were actually, it wasn't so much response, it was stability. It was amazing stability. So when the cancer patients started saying people had got COVID and nothing worked for them, I suggested low-dose naltrexone on the grounds that high IL-6 goes with cancer and COVID. And I've seen and reported, I've written a chapter and we're writing a major paper now on it, that IL-6 has an amazing effect on, giving low-dose naltrexone to patients with long COVID has an amazing effect on their symptoms. And what's really interesting is that the first symptom, they all say, disappears very quickly is brain fog. Well, my God, that is the biggest impediment to work. If you've got brain fog, you can't even work the computer. I think that actually might have been is possibly due to a co-discovery, which we couldn't replicate, but we now realize we used a different class of cell, that it inhibits IL-4 as well. And IL-4 is expressed on microglia. So I think that quick recovery is due to the low-dose naltrexone's effect on IL-4. The effect on shortness of breath and fatigue takes 2 or 3 weeks. And I think that's due to the IL-9 shutting down the IL-6 and the inflammation pathways. I've tried desperately for people to do a study in it, but they all say haven't got the resources. They seem to actually have the resources for doing all these vaccines, but a simple thing like this, there's It's really frustrating.
There's no money in these older generic medicines. But what you're saying is so fascinating, especially since ivermectin is one of those things that modulates interleukin-6 as well. And I've heard of it being used to treat cancer too in cancer protocols. Yes. So it's really fascinating. If one had the funds and the resources to research these other medicines, these generic medicines that are cheap, we probably wouldn't need these new big pharma drugs at all. We need.
It's fascinating you say that, because the guy came up to me wanting to. He was a patient of mine. And he was very, very rich, and he wanted to see whether he could kind of fast track drugs in the future. And I said, and he was quite a philosopher, and I posited, there is a possibility that we don't need any new fast-track drugs. They're already all out there. It's just the matter that we haven't screened them and appropriately validated them properly. And I remember saying that is a possibility, because there are so many drugs out there which do have added knock-on parallel functions which are useful in other diseases. And that's always been the case, but with outside of serendipity, they never get unveiled properly. Mm-hmm. I certainly think low-dose naltrexone is a fantastic cancer agent who I really want to put in the clinic. I spend all my time trying to persuade somebody to do it. I mean, if you pay for the trial, and hence the problem, the trials are so expensive. You can get protection even off patent for a couple of years in most jurisdictions now, but it's just people can't think beyond that. I mean, it's very frustrating.
I think what you're saying is really interesting, because, as a doctor with this wealth of experience, and you're talking about a medicine, a safe, cheap old medicine that's really been around for a long time and is very cheap, then there should be a certain amount of leeway, and I think there always has been, for you to try it, to give something a try if there's nothing to lose, really. I know we've put this real emphasis on the gold standard being an RCT, or randomized controlled trial. But during COVID, we've seen how easily these trials can be corrupted as well. And goodness knows how many trials have been corrupted in the past we haven't even picked up on, that have led to the approval of new drugs, and then and then studies down the line show that actually they're not that safe, or they don't work. So what is your feeling about this? Do you think doctors should be allowed to use safe old medicines that they think might have a chance at helping?
Yes, I do, but it's nice to get the evidence, say, I told you so, without the randomized controlled trial business. It's interesting that, I've come from oncology, and one of my he wasn't a direct mentor, but when I was doing my research at the Institute of Cancer Research, there was a couple of professors, and one of them, who sadly passed away not that long ago, Mike Peckham. He basically didn't do randomized controlled trials. He did non-randomized gradual evolution improvements. So you get a hit with a lymphoma with one drug, but it's obviously not good enough. So the next few patients get A and B added. And basically they did that till they ended up with like CHOP, for Hodgkin's lymphoma, for instance. And then when they get another one come along, like rituximab, they add that on, so it comes CHOP-R. and all that sort of became standard practice without going through any of these great big things. And so I don't see why, with a lot of the other things, we can't do that today, particularly when we're dealing with a lot of agents that unlike the COVID vaccines, they're not dangerous and toxic. And we've known that from tens, hundreds of thousands of patients have been using these for something else. So why put these barriers up? I've always been told every time I try to push the envelope to say, why can't we use this, get this quick? We've got these small randomized studies, but they work, there's no toxicity. Why can't we just get that through there? Oh, no, we have to do the large studies for safety reasons. No, you don't. because what you're using is being done even with thousands of patients with no SAE. I've worked with two things which I've been pushing through for years. None of them has ever had an SAE 3 or 4 ever. So why would you need to do a larger study for safety reasons? I mean, if they now use everything to, as you said, to corrupt, it's very easy to set a trial up to get something to succeed, depending on how you do it, and equally to set a trial up to show that that doesn't work or fails. And I mean, the very, very recent thing is a study which people have been saying, oh, vitamin D does no good, this, that, and the other. Well, I mean, there's loads of trials there showing that vitamin D supplementation would have been probably far more useful than going down the vaccine route. And I greatly believe that to be the case. But now they're all focusing on what to me seems like a contrived trial to show that vitamin D didn't work in a randomized study. But I mean, there's lots of flaws, and Will Jones goes over it in The Daily Skeptic very well. But the bottom one, as I always said, is the thing here. You tell everybody how marvelous this thing is, and you randomize to them, and it's informed consent. Well, anybody who actually reads and thinks for themselves, well, this stuff's marvelous, but I know my local chemist sells it to £1 a week. I think I'll go and get it just in case. Of course, try trouble having a statistical difference because, and did they measure whether those patients were taking it and what the levels were? You know, so it is very easy to do very bad trials. We now know all the early trials with elastin, which they had a positive signal to the point where they got, was it Patricia Hewitt at the time to give it urgent early approval for breast cancer because of the political lobbying. And now we know that it's not worth it. But it helped make it one of the most profitable drugs ever made by a big pharma.
Yeah, we've seen Patrick Holford looking at Alzheimer's and looking at supplements and how supplements improve Alzheimer's. And prevent Alzheimer's, and diet and supplements prevent Alzheimer's, and so also with COVID vaccine injury groups, we're seeing people doing their own research. So I think what we're going to see going forward is really people-based research using these safe older medicines and kind of feeding back to us doctors as to what works and what doesn't, because the trials are so costly and they're not necessary for these safe old medicines, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. The idea of the patients doing their own trials, as it were, it's brought to my attention that there are such sites where people have rare diseases and there's no one thing that works for them. So they report what they take and rate it back onto a site of patients with rare diseases. And it was very interesting to see that for fibromyalgia, low-dose naltrexone came up as the most useful drug, and they tried dozens and dozens. I mean, to me, that type of information is probably more useful than randomized trials because it's real-world data.
Yes.
I mean, now so much trial data is not real world.
Yes, I think you only need randomized controlled trials in with drugs that are potentially very unsafe or potentially unsafe, new drugs, rather than these older ones where people can get them over the counter and try them, or where they've been around for so long and their safety profiles well documented and they're safe. So, gosh, I think we could probably go on for another hour or so because it's so fascinating speaking with you and hearing about your experiences. I know that our audience is limited for time, though. There's so much to watch these days. Is there any final message you'd like to give people watching, either doctors or patients?
Well, certainly, I'd like to say to the doctors is we do have to realise that we've been pre-programmed as to what to expect and what to see. and that this so-called misinformation business has been layered on so heavily that I know close colleagues of mine react, and I go, how can you possibly react like that? You just sound like you're being completely programmed by all the rubbish that's coming from the media. Why don't you actually look and say, put everything aside, are my patients benefiting from the vaccines and boosters? Are they? Because we know there's no point giving it to you because the virus is no longer there. Is there any benefit at all? And more interesting, when they complain of something, think, could it be cause and effect? Could be coincidence. But what I'm finding is that so many doctors are telling me, oh, no, it's just a coincidence. They're not thinking, they're just going, oh, it's a coincidence. I mean, they've been programmed. And those who suspect something aren't saying things because they're worried about their career. The younger doctors are picking these things up. They're worried about it because they're told not to report. This is a terrible Orwellian situation. So my message to doctors is say, we're meant to be independent. We're meant to do the best for the patients, not what we're told to do by some Orwellian government that thinks it's following a science that they've shown is fake and false in the way everything's turned out to be.
Professor Dalgleish, thank you so much for your wise words and advice.
Okay, thank you.